So I guess the first question that I have to ask you, based upon this presentation that you've given, and also the passage that you chose to read, is, and also given the fact that I worked for many, many years in a shortwave broadcaster, which is, when you were a kid, did you spend a lot of time with the headphone pressed to your ear, tuning, trying to find that voice in the dark?
I did. Mostly because I wasn't allowed to. I had a strict bedtime, and I loved baseball. And in the summer, the games would go past my bedtime, and I would sneak up. I had a crystal radio that I had built from a kit, and I would sneak up and say, "Oh, I'm going to bed, Mom," and then under the covers I would listen to the ends of games. And then sometimes I get very excited and yell, and I think maybe my parents figured it out and kind of tolerated it. And then later, as I got older, I loved scanning, especially shortwave, and trying to see how far away you could get a broadcast. And yeah, I mean, it's just an amazing thing to hear the voice of a stranger very far away, living a totally different life. Suddenly, it's the same role books had for me, too. It's suddenly you're open to all these other possibilities.
Can I ask you, and this is something I like to ask all writers, and that is, what does your writing desk look like?
My writing desk look like?
Yeah.
I got it from my
father-in-law.
It's very dirty. I should probably get a new desk someday. It's cluttered. A lot of people send me things, so I have lots of papers on it, and I always try to just shove those into a corner, and it's covered with things, papers and notes. And
What part of the house is it in?
I rent an office outside of my home because at home I have too many things to procrastinate with.
Yeah.
So I was tempted for a long time to have no internet at all in the office. But occasionally I need it. Occasionally now people expect you to return emails like within 40 minutes of sending them. So occasionally now I have to send emails or large attachments. And I use the internet for research in some ways, especially photographs. I think the access to archival photographs for historical research is amazing, and it's instantaneous. And I live in a pretty remote part of the United States in Idaho, and so being able to look at photos of old things very quickly is an amazing thing.
Where were you when you wrote the passage you read? At your desk?
That's a great question. Probably, all over the place. There's a fallacy that writers just write something once. I mean, I wrote, I'm sure, some early version of that, but it probably went over it 80 times in 80 different places, hotel rooms and airplanes and at my desk, and really anything that eventually makes into a book. You've read through it so many times, you're almost blind to all of its flaws, but you're working on it all these different places, and you're always changing it and tweaking it a little bit, and mostly cutting crappy things out of it, Yeah.
When you were writing just that one package, that one little passage, the section, especially the very detailed description of the radio and the very detailed description of everything that was going on around Werner and Jutta as they were trying to tune that thing in and trying to listen, and life is going on around them. What was going through your head when that happened, when you were writing that?
It's funny, I mentioned my brother Chris in the talk. There was a summer when I was maybe 8, and he was probably 13 when he stopped going outside. This was the summer that Radio Shack, which is a company in the United States, released really the first personal computer. It was called a TRS-80. It's humongous. And that summer he bought it, and he just took it apart. He was fearless about taking things apart. And we were like, oh, Chris is never, he was pale all summer, he never went out. We're like, what a loser. But of course, it turned out he had the last laugh in the end. He made like the first computer games I had ever seen on that thing. The hard drive was a magnetic tape. It was like a tape deck the size of a couch. It was huge.
Is that where you were in your mind when you were writing that?
Yeah, I was thinking about Chris a lot there. That single-minded fascination with electronic things, he really had it. And his fearlessness about tinkering, he still has that.
Yeah. So, not to put words in your mouth, but it was kind of like a warm, nostalgic feeling that you were trying to recreate.
Yes, but the whole time you're in this terror that you're trying to help your reader empathize with a kid who will wind up as part of the Third Reich. And so I was terrified all the time about it. I still am.
Well, you know what? As long as you brought that up, why were you worried at all when you were writing a character like Werner, who was clearly going to be a Hitler youth kid, somebody who me and you and probably everybody in this room have been trained by 70 years of stories, other people's stories and history, to not find sympathetic. Why did you choose to make him like that? Why did you choose to have a child who was going to be a Hitlerjeugd child as one of your main characters?
Just to see if it was possible in some ways, to see if I could ask a reader to empathize as deeply with him. If you really believe fiction is a tool for empathy, can you ask a reader to understand his story? Part of it is their children, and so you get to see their formation into young adults. And Marie is somebody we're more used to empathizing with, a person who's being occupied versus the occupier. But I also think Werner makes a lot of moral failings in the novel. I'm not judging him for that. I think I may have made a lot of those decisions too. I built a character into the novel named Frederick, who's a friend of his, who really in many ways in every way has more moral fiber than Werner does. And really he's there to reflect Werner's mistakes. Hopefully while you're not rooting for Werner as much as you're understanding why he's making these decisions that he does. I hate to give away anything for folks who don't know the book.
Yeah, there's going to be some spoilers in this. It's kind of hard to get around it. Raise your hand if you've read the book. Oh, that's quite a lot of you.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Actually, okay. Pretty good. I feel a little less guilty now. Getting back to Werner for a moment, were you at all worried that you would be criticized?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I worry about everything all the time. I'm up all night and worrying about everything.
What were you most worried about?
In Werner's case or the whole entire book?
In Werner's case, specifically in Werner's case. And then we'll get to the book.
Mostly we just want there is still, for the next 12, 15 years, there are people for whom these events are memory, particularly in Sint-Malo. And it is so important to try to render these experiences with historical fidelity. You can never do enough research, but at the same time, you'll never finish your book if sometimes research can just be procrastination. You're just, because of fear, you keep reading more and more instead of just imagining. What specifically was
your fear? What were you afraid of?
That I'm not being respectful to families who were damaged by the Third Reich. That's what we were grown up, raised to hate. Politicians still invoke the narrative of World War II as the clear moral war. This is the time when the Allies were right and the Axis was wrong. And of course, in almost every way, that's true. But in terms of individuals and humans, life is much more complicated. And it's so important to me that my children don't grow up the way the war is presented to them through video games and the History Channel. It's all very black and white, and Germans are just getting mowed down in these games, and so you don't think about them as humans. You don't think about these little decisions that we make. Like, what am I complicit in? What are all of us complicit in right now? Those of us who used a plastic bottle today, for example, or those of us who flew on an airplane today or drove a car today. What kind of global catastrophe are we complicit in that we just think it's okay because everybody else around us is doing it also?
Yeah, but that's all of us in it together. You wrote a lead character who was a Hitlerjeugd kid, and you did that, and he was in your book. So I guess what I'm wondering about was what your you're afraid of offending people. That's what it sounds like you're saying, yes?
You're afraid of not being faithful to history in some way. But it's also a work of the imagination, and you hope your reader will allow you that. I'm also trying to build a framework of fairy tale into the book, so you hope that your reader allows you some leeway in terms of getting every single detail right.
Was anybody offended? 1 million books sold.
No, mostly I get more things that I got wrong. Like engineers will write you and say, you need to move, this formula is not exactly correct on the triangulation. There's a lot of triangulation in the book. Or, you get malacologists who write you like, this snail actually exists in this part of the Atlantic. People love to write you these letters. But I'm very grateful. The greatest thing about ebooks, I was telling Jessica earlier, my editor here, is that, you can make these changes. I just send them right to my editor. I'm like, let's make this change in the ebook right now. Somebody wrote me somebody who studies gems wrote me, and I called the diamond at one point octahedral, and he said, no, it's tetrahedral. So I spent like a half hour writing this email. I'm like, we need to change octahedral to tetrahedral.
Speaking of your editor, when you came to your editor with the idea that you were going to write a Second World War novel, just how upset did he or she get?
Oh, yeah, I never do that. Unlike a lot of nonfiction writers, I try not to even describe the project I'm working on until it's done. So it's not something you would say. If you're really financially strapped, some fiction writers will sell a book before it's done. I'll call it a partial or a proposal. But that scares me. I would much rather complete something and then deal with the capitalist side of the world.
Let me just ask you also specifically. I mean, you just told the germination of the story. I told the germination of the story. But why did you specifically want to tell this almost fairy tale-like story about two innocents who are slowly ground down by this adult Armageddon all around them? What was it inside of you that wanted to tell that tale?
That's one of those questions that, people, you can't really choose your subjects. Those decisions are subconscious, and, I don't know why I'm fascinated by radio as much as, I just always have been, and I can try to articulate that only through telling the story, really. It's rare that you ever sit down as a fiction writer and think, this is my subject, and now I will decide why this will be my subject. You just start playing around with it. Really, all of art making is some kind of play. It comes out of playfulness, and whether you're moving paint around on a canvas or moving notes around on the piano or moving images around on a screen, or in the writer's case, moving words around and sentences around inside paragraphs, you're mostly making things, then you sleep, you wake up, you try to understand what this thing is you're making and try to make it a little bit stronger, and then you go to sleep.
It's really interesting because you went back to radio again, talking about your book. But it seems to me that radio is, in your book, a method that you use to tell a much greater story about what I feel is the loss of innocence, the complication of life. Somehow you managed to achieve this almost, as I said, fairy tale-like quality throughout the book. But it doesn't seem to me that your book is about radio. What do you think about that?
That's something critics are far better at than artists, I think. I can't, when my editor has to write the flap copy, the thing they put on the book to describe a book, it just sounds like a nightmare to me. I could never do that. Flannery O'Connor said it takes every word of a story to tell the story, and I think that's kind of how I feel. The worst, I don't tell anybody on airplanes that I'm a writer, because they'll say, like, oh, what books have you written? What's that about? And you're like, oh, boy, here it goes. And you're like...
So it sounds to me like you're not really 100% sure what the major themes are in the book. That you wrote.
That's true. I think, those things come, so much of your energy is in trying to make the world plausible and make this dream for a reader seamless so that a reader doesn't wake from it. And then it's only later when you're doing the dishes or walking your dog that you start thinking, what is this thing? And sure, there's all kinds of play with light and dark in the book, of course with keys and locks and restricting access to things and the constriction of access versus the freedom of access. It was really important to me thematically to end the book the way it does, which I won't give too much away by just saying it ends in 2014 with an image of all the electromagnetic waves around Marie, and my editor was kind of resisting that, and for me that was a thematic decision. I felt like we need to ask ourselves, how is technology being used now? The best historical novels for me somehow make some kind of inroads into now and the future, and so I wanted to ask, what technologies are being used for purposes of violence now, and I think the only way to do that was to turn the book towards the end. So all that's a long way of saying, sure, there are times when you're thinking thematically, but most of the time, I think 90% of your energy is on getting the language and the music of the language to sound right, and getting the world to feel vivid to a reader, and the characters to feel like humans and not just black marks on a white page. Ultimately, it's alchemy. You know, it's a trick you're playing on the reader. You're trying to make whole worlds, and all you're doing is using these really inexpensive materials called words.
Can we talk about Marie-Laure? Because we talked about Werner, so let's talk about Marie-Laure.
Okay.
How did she come into being?
Like I said, I envisioned her pretty early as visually impaired, and maybe a more capable, morally capable person than Werner.
Why did you make her blind?
There's a lot of answers to that. A somewhat reductive one is that my sister, my wife's oldest sister, my sister-in-law, is disabled, and she, even though it's a lot of work, she's in her 50s now, it's a lot of work being with her, she just sees the world with so much innocence and joy, and she brings joy to our lives, especially around the holidays. Christmas is like an amazing thing with her. And I've always just been fascinated trying to depict the abilities of disabled people without romanticizing it. I hope Marie still comes across as her life was very difficult. But and then when I started reading memoirs of people who had gone blind in their childhood, and how in many ways the brain is so plastic, and the way it remapped them to see colors and to use music, for example, and of course books, then I thought, okay, I've got my character. She'll love books, and she'll be an intellectually curious person, and how can I help her find her way to maintain an intellectual curiosity during the occupation when everything is so restricted?
I thought at some point you'd say, because she can't see light.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, maybe that's part of it too. Yeah,
maybe, or...
Sure, yeah, you're just kind of fumbling your way through. Thematically, it does fit, though, yes. But I mean, for me, it's so refreshing visiting students in particular, because the English teacher will say things like, what does this represent? And for me, that's for the reader to decide. I don't ever have a very overt idea about what certain things will represent. The idea that a theme can be pulled out of a story, Flannery O'Connor again said, it's like the string on a feed of chickens, a sack of chicken feed, that you can pull the theme out and look at it. It's never seemed to her like an appropriate metaphor, and it doesn't seem like that to me either. It's all integrated into the whole of it.
Perhaps this is a little too Dutch-centric on my part. But when Marie-Laure was hiding from the German sergeant in the attic, it sort of reminded me of another girl hiding in an attic from the Germans in Amsterdam. Who could that be? I can't possibly be the first person to have brought this up to you.
Yeah, of course. No, that book was hugely important to me. My sons are here with me, and my wife is reading that to them while they're in Amsterdam. For me, that book was so important to me because it teaches you about how books help the dead live again. For the world, that girl's voice lives inside that language still. And that's what writing can do. It's this intoxicating democratic magic,
Were you at all thinking of Anne Frank during that passage? Was that an inspiration,
sure.
Or is it just coincidence?
You're certainly never thinking like, now I will write a parallel of Anne Frank. Mostly you're worried, you think, can I use an image of an attic in any way anymore, especially tying it to World War II. You worry that somehow through repetition things lose their power. But in terms of the mechanics and the choreography of the story, I needed her to be in an attic. There was really no other logical place that you could broadcast from than very high in the tall buildings, and so I thought that's where I need that radio to be.
So it's just a coincidence, just to be 100% clear on this.
It's definitely not just a coincidence. Certainly it was in my mind.
Oh, it was?
That
Okay.
story is part of one of the many things I've read set during World War II, so sure, of course.
Okay. It took you how long to write this book?
10 years, but I get so overwhelmed, particularly reading about the Eastern Front and the destruction of human beings on the Eastern Front, that there would be times where I'd take a break from the material and write other things. So it wasn't like I worked every single day for 10 years. There were days, especially if I wasn't teaching, where that's all I would do all day is read about the destruction of human beings, and so I would try to maybe take a month off and work on other projects.
Yeah. 10 years is a really long time. Were there moments when you would become completely frustrated with the book? Maybe
Yes, of course.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's true with any long project. I mean, doubt is a big part of making things, and failure, and you're always it's always trial and error for me, and so you try scenes, and you have to. So much of maturity as an artist, whatever form you want to work in, is learning to get rid of things that took a long time to make. Whether you're writing songs or making films or making paintings, and it's all just, you have to tell yourself it's a very windy path through the darkness to try to get from point A to point B, but you have to kind of take that path, and that's really the joy of being an artist. If you knew how something was going to end or what it would look like, it wouldn't be fun to make the thing.
And what was the lowest point of the process for you?
Oh man, there were several. There were lots of times when I thought I'll never finish it,
Where was the moment when you thought to yourself, why did I ever become a writer? I'm going to go get a job at McDonald's.
Oh, yeah, those happen all the time. That happened today on the train up here. Anytime you're trying to make something, it's scary. And fear can stop you in so many ways. I see it in friends who are novelists who have published 10 books, and I see it in students who are trying to write their first book. They're just so afraid they can't embrace the fact that, of course, you'll fail. Human language is an attempt to articulate the inarticulable, to really describe the glowing, shimmering, amazing thing that is a tree. Words don't quite all the way get there, but sometimes you can combine them in a way that some sublimity, the reader meets you halfway, and somehow together you can make some kind of connection that approximates the beauty of the world or an experience.
Well, what do you do when you have one of your deep, dark moments of anxiety, fear, feeling like a failure? How do you get out of it?
You can remind yourself that you've done it before, that, grit is something that gets a lot of projects done. And so you can say, this will pass, but it doesn't always help. In a lot of ways, writing, there's a parallel to working out. There are days when you're like, oh my gosh, I do not want to exercise today. But when you do, you feel better. So you just try to make yourself do it in the morning. And even if it's a miserable day and it's not going well, at least you've done it. And then you feel a little lighter for the rest of the day.
So 10 years is a long time to write a book. How did you know you were done?
That's something I don't struggle with as much as certainly some of my students. There's the old saw about when you start going through it and taking all the commas out, and then the next day you go through and put all the commas back in. That's kind of a sign that you're just tinkering with minutia. That's another kind of fear. For me, I think I felt like it was done when I'm ready to show it to my wife, and it's not perfect by any means, but you're ready to show it to another human being, and then they help you articulate maybe what's not working, and you start going back. It's like you build this car in your garage, and you think it runs, but it doesn't really run. Then you have to take it apart, and then your editor makes you really take it apart and put it back together.
I just wonder what that moment was like when because a decade passed. Bush was already out of office.
Yeah.
We were into the Obama era, as you pointed out. And then you finally, you're sitting there at your computer and you put in that last period. And then you think to yourself, well, that's the novel. I've got
Right.
that's the novel.
It's more like, gosh, my neck hurts and I'm starving. And sometimes when you're writing while you only eat for 6 or 7 hours, you're like, where am I? I need to move around. So for me, it was more a relief that if my computer failed and the hard drive I store in my freezer had failed, that, the thing is done and my wife doesn't have to go after my death if I get hit by a bus or something and piece together all these terrible chapters and try to make something. At least it's done in that sense. You can print it out.
You mentioned your wife a lot. Was when you printed out the thing and you brought it to her and you said, I'm done. What did you say to her when you brought it to her? And then what did she say?
Well, she had been reading, so she was just wanting to read more, and then she gets very angry about what happens to the characters.
Oh, what did she get most angry about?
Oh, I probably can't talk about that unless people have finished the book. The same thing a lot of readers are getting mad at me about.
Oh, what are readers getting mad at you about?
I won't spoil it. So, I'm only saying this because I did an event maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago in the States with like 1,000 people at it, and a woman asked me about Werner, and at the end, towards the end of the event, and the whole crowd turned on her. It was ruthless. They're like, boo, and she left. She left the auditorium. So I don't want to alienate anybody who hasn't read the book.
Okay. We won't go there.
Okay.
Except about the fact that... No, I won't say it. So, just a couple more questions.
Oh, sorry, guys.
Just a couple more questions, and then I'm going to throw it out there to you good folks. I guess, has Hollywood come a calling yet?
Yeah, the option sold the day the book came out, but that doesn't mean all that much. It does and it doesn't. Well, you did it at the gasp, so maybe it does. With the same thing with stories. When an option gets sold, it's exciting, but I've learned to realize that it's impossible to make a film, and you need so many pieces to fall in. And I'm much more interested in prose. As a novelist, you can make buildings explode and characters age and costume changes, and you don't have to think about capitalism. And filmmakers have to think about all of that. So, we can't have this building explode because that's going to cost a lot of money.
But at least Hollywood optioned it. So now we have the opportunity to fantasize about who can star in the movie.
I guess, yeah, it's good.
So who would play Werner?
Oh my, I'm not the right person
child
to
actors.
ask.
What? Who would you like to direct it?
Oh, I don't know any of those questions. Scott Rudin is the producer attached to the film, and it's at the place called Fox Searchlight, and they make some nice-looking films. But I'm not in that world, and
I know. But do you watch movies? You like movies?
I do, but I don't always remember the names of actors or anything.
You don't.
I would like Herman Melville to play Werner, and Virginia Woolf to play Marie. There are websites that do that. There's some website that picks the actors. And
somehow I feel like you're not taking this question seriously.
I think it's good to let collaborative arts fascinate me, and I'm very jealous of them. Making stories by yourself is a strange and lonely thing, and I love that filmmakers get to have an actress contribute. A scriptwriter can kind of have what she says, but maybe she changes the line, and maybe the director changes the line, and I get quite jealous of that. I think that would be an amazing experience to be a part of. Certainly at the theater, I think it's so neat to see a play change so much depending on who stars in it, who directs it. As a novelist, you just hope it's in good hands.